When I was 10, my dad said, "You'll never be half the man I am." I spent years trying to prove him wrong. But when he ended up in a nursing home, angry and alone, I brought his favorite music, fed him by hand, and stayed till the end. He never apologized. I didn't need him to. When I was 10, my dad told me I'd never be half the man he was. It wasn't a shout or a lecture, just a cold, offhand remark thrown over his shoulder as he walked out of the garage, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. I don't remember exactly what I'd done to earn it. Maybe I'd cried when he yelled at me for dropping a wrench, or maybe I'd hesitated when he told me to climb a rickety ladder to grab something from the shelf. Whatever it was, his words hit me like a stone sinking into deep water, settling heavy in my chest. I stood there, a skinny kid in a too-big flannel, my hands still greasy from trying to help him fix the old pickup truck. I didn't cry, not then. But I felt something shift inside me, a storm of emotions I couldn't name. Shame, maybe, for not being what he wanted. Fear that he was right. And a stubborn, burning need to prove him wrong. I made a silent vow that day. I'd be better than him, stronger, tougher, not in his way, but in mine. Dad's idea of a man was clear, even to a 10-year-old. It was in the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, jaw set, never asking for help. It was in the way he worked long hours at the steel mill, coming home with calloused hands and a temper that could flare without warning. It was in the way he dismissed anything soft, tears, apologies, hugs, as weakness. To him, being a man meant standing alone, unyielding, a fortress no one could breach. And I, with my tendency to cry at sad movies or talk about how I felt, was already failing his test. I didn't hate him for it. That would have been simpler. Instead, I loved him in that complicated way kids love parents who hurt them, desperately, hopefully, always waiting for the moment they'd see you. I spent my childhood chasing that moment. I'd try to mimic his stoicism, biting my lip when I fell off my bike, forcing myself to laugh when he teased me for being soft. But it never worked. The harder I tried to be what he wanted, the more I felt like I was betraying myself. By middle school, I started rebelling in my own quiet way. I'd cry at the end of The Iron Giant and not hide it. I'd hug my friends when they were upset, even if the other boys smirked. I'd volunteer at the local food bank, not because it looked good on a resume, but because it felt right. I'd talk to my English teacher about anxiety and sadness, words Dad would have scoffed at. Each choice was a small defiance, a way of saying, "I'm not you and I don't want to be." But his voice never left me. "You'll never be half the man I am." It echoed in my head during every moment of doubt, every time I wondered if I was enough. High school was harder. I was a decent student, played soccer, had a tight group of friends. But Dad's expectations loomed larger as I got older. He'd watch me practice and mutter about how I wasn't aggressive enough on the field. He'd see me reading a book and ask why I wasn't out doing something useful. When I got a part-time job at a coffee shop, he called it women's work. I'd grit my teeth and keep going, determined to prove that being a man didn't mean being hard or cold. But no matter what I did, good grades, a game-winning goal, a promotion at work, it was never enough for him. He didn't criticize outright, not always. Sometimes it was just a look, a raised eyebrow, a silence that said more than words ever could. I kept waiting for him to see me, to say I was wrong. "You're doing okay, kid." That hope kept me tethered to him, even as it hurt. When I turned 18, I moved out. Not far, just a small apartment across town, paid for with my coffee shop wages and a scholarship for community college. I told myself it was about independence, but deep down I knew it was about escape. Living with Dad was like living under a microscope, every move judged against his impossible standard. I needed space to figure out who I was when his voice wasn't, the loudest thing in my head. We barely talked after that. I'd call on holidays, out of duty more than desire. He'd answer, gruff and distracted, asking about my job or my classes, but never really listening to the answers. I didn't volunteer much either. What was there to say? That I was majoring in social work because I wanted to help people? That I'd started therapy to untangle the knot of insecurity he'd tied in me? He wouldn't understand, and I didn't have the energy to explain. Life moved on. I graduated, got a job at a nonprofit helping at-risk youth, started building a life that felt like mine. I made friends who didn't judge me for being too emotional. I dated, fell in love, got my heart broken, and learned to keep going. I volunteered more, wrote poetry in my spare time, even started a small community garden in my neighborhood. Each step felt like a brick in a wall I was building, not to keep people out, but to define my own space. Dad faded into the background, a ghost I didn't know how to mourn. My therapist asked me once if I'd grieved the father I never had, the one who might have hugged me, told me he was proud, seen me as enough. I said no. How do you grieve someone who's still alive but never really there? I told her it was easier to let him go, to focus on the life I was building. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd still hear his voice. You'll never be half the man I am. And I'd wonder if I was still trying to prove him wrong. Then came the call. I was 32, sitting in my apartment grading papers for a mentoring program I ran. The phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, calm but professional, told me my dad had had a stroke. He was in a nursing home now, recovering but not fully. The damage was significant. Speech, mobility, memory, all affected. They'd found my number in an old notebook he kept in his wallet. No other family was listed. My mom had died years ago, cancer taking her quickly when I was in my 20s. I was all he had left. I didn't say anything for a long time. The woman asked if I'd visit. I said I'd think about it. For weeks, I wrestled with it. Part of me wanted to ignore the call, to let him face the consequences of his life alone, just as he'd always preached. He didn't deserve my time, not after years of making me feel small. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being 10, standing in the garage, hoping for his approval, couldn't let it go. I wasn't thinking about him, not really. I was thinking about me, about the kid who'd promised to be better, about what it would mean to walk away for good. So I went. The nursing home smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. It was a beige, sterile place, the kind that tries to feel warm but doesn't quite manage it. Dad was in a small room at the end of a hall, sitting in a wheelchair by a window that looked out on a parking lot. He was thinner than I remembered, his broad shoulders hunched, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. The man who'd once seemed like a giant was now a question mark, curled into himself. He didn't recognize me at first. His eyes, still sharp but clouded with confusion, studied me like I was a stranger. I said my name, told him I was his son. He blinked, his mouth twitching like he was trying to place me. Then he nodded, more to himself than to me, and looked away. I didn't know what I'd expected. A tearful reunion? A sudden outpouring of regret? Whatever I'd hoped for, it wasn't this. A tired old man who barely knew I was there. But I came back the next week. And the week after that. I don't know why, exactly. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to prove something, not to him, but to myself. I started bringing things. A small Bluetooth speaker with his favorite music. Classic rock, soul, the stuff he used to blast in the garage on weekends. The Rolling Stones, Otis Redding, Creedence Clearwater Revival. He'd close his eyes when I played it, his shaky fingers, tapping the armrest, sometimes humming along to Ain't No Sunshine or Paint It Black. It was the closest I'd ever seen him to peaceful. The nurses said he'd stopped eating full meals, so I started bringing food. Soft oatmeal cookies from the bakery he used to love. Sliced apples with peanut butter. Soup in a thermos I'd warm, up at home. I'd feed him by hand when he couldn't manage the spoon, wiping his chin when it spilled. He never thanked me, but he didn't push me away either. That felt like progress. Some days he was lucid. He'd ask questions, his voice slurred but sharp. "What do you do for work?" he asked once, out of nowhere. I told him about my job, about helping kids who felt lost, about the community garden I'd started. He listened, or seemed to, then muttered, "Huh." No praise, no criticism, just a neutral sound. For him, that was a conversation. Other days, he was somewhere else. He'd ask about Mom, forgetting she'd been gone for years. I'd remind him gently, and he'd nod, his eyes drifting to his lap like he was losing her all over again. Once he asked if I was married. I said no, not yet, but I was happy. He didn't respond, just stared out the window. I kept coming back. Not for him, not really, but for the part of me that needed to know I could show up without expecting anything in return. Each visit was a choice. To care, to be present, to be the man I'd decided to be, not the one he'd tried to shape. The nurses started to know me by name. One of them, a kind woman named Maria, pulled me aside one day. "He talks about you when you're not here," she said. "Says you're the only one who still comes." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so long feeling invisible to him, and now in his fractured mind, I was the one thing he held on to. As the months passed, Dad got quieter. The music didn't spark him anymore. He stopped eating the cookies, then the soup. He'd stare at the ceiling, his breath shallow, his hands still. I'd sit with him, sometimes reading aloud from a book of short stories I'd found in his old things. Sometimes I'd just hold his hand, when he let me. It was bony and cold, nothing like the hands that used to toss me a football or fix a carburetor. The night he died, I was there. It was late, the nursing home quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I'd been reading to him a story about a man rebuilding his life after loss. His breathing slowed, each pause longer than the last. I put the book down and watched him, my own breath catching. Then it stopped. No drama, no final words, just a quiet end. I pressed the call button and sat with him until the nurses came. They were gentle, professional, but I barely heard them. I just kept looking at him, wondering if he'd ever known how hard I'd tried to be enough. The funeral was small. A few co-workers from his old job, a neighbor, a cousin I hadn't seen in years. I gave the eulogy, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I talked about his strength, his stubbornness, the way he'd loved music and a cold beer on a summer night. I didn't mention the things he'd said to me, the ways he'd made me feel small. That wasn't the point. I wanted to remember him as a man who'd tried, in his own flawed way, to be something. Afterward, I went home and sat on my porch, playing Ain't No Sunshine on my phone. I don't know if it was for him or for me, maybe both. Dad never apologized. Not for that day in the garage, not for the years of distance, not for anything. And I didn't need him to. I'd spent my life trying to prove him wrong, but in the end, it wasn't about him. It was about me, about choosing to be a man who shows up, who cares, who loves without expecting anything back. I'm not half the man he was. I'm something else entirely, and that's enough.